The first French explorer to arrive on the shores of North America was Jacques Cartier, who entered the St. Lawrence River in 1534. From that point on, French traders and adventurers followed slowly over the last decades of the 16th century. Then in 1609, Samuel de Champlain began construction of the settlement of Quebec and French expansion from the region of the St. Lawrence River throughout the Great Lakes. Generations of French woodsmen spread into the wilderness to trap and hunt animals for their fur. They adopted the lifestyle of the tribal peoples they encountered and were often adopted into the tribes they traded with. The territory entered into by these Europeans was thinly populated by Amerindians, each tribe controlling a region won by conquest. European conflicts between France and England spilled over to North America in 1689, following removal of Charles II from England's throne and the arrival of William of Orange from the Netherlands. The governor of New France responded to an escalation of Iroquois attacks by enlisting the northern tribes to attack English settlements in New England and New York. In response, English colonial militia joined forces to attack Montreal, but the enterprise failed. After a few years of tense peace, in 1702, England declared war again against Spain and France. What began as a war over who would ascend to the Spanish throne became known as Queen Anne's War. By this time, the population of Britain's North American colonies had reached an estimated 250,000 people. A small number of brave and land-hungry colonials were establishing small settlements in the wilderness as far as the eastern slopes of the Appalachian mountain chain. Queen Anne's War came to its inconclusive end, and the Treaty of Utrecht was signed in 1713. The French relinquished control over Acadia, which the British renamed Nova Scotia, as well as Newfoundland and fur trading posts in the Hudson Bay area. France managed to retain several islands in the St. Lawrence River, as well as Cape Breton Island at the northeastern end of Nova Scotia. Yet another European conflict erupted in 1740, ostensibly over who would succeed to the throne of Austria. Britain was drawn diplomatically into that conflict in 1742 as an ally of Austria against France and Prussia. In May of 1744, the French dispatched a strong naval force from their fortress at Louisbourg against British positions in the Grand Banks area, where fishing rights were in dispute. Massachusetts Governor William Shirley responded the following year with an expedition that took the French fortress at Louisbourg after a 6-week siege. The French hold on North America was clearly weakened. One problem the French could not overcome was a more than 20-to-1 disadvantage in population. For every English settler or family killed on the frontier, there were many others standing by, waiting for an end to hostilities to return to abandoned regions. One aspect of the French dilemma was turmoil in France caused by renewed religious fanaticism. Thousands of Huguenots were being killed or imprisoned. These and many others could be sent to populate New France to begin lives of self-sufficiency, but the king seemed oblivious to the threats either at home or in New France. In March of 1746, the French governor stated his position in a letter sent to the French colonial minister. As chief representative of the American policy of France, I feel that, cost what it might, we must hold fast to Canada and link her to Louisiana, not only with forts, but even more importantly with no less than 10,000 settlers from the mother country. These people from all stations in our society should be spread to settle and multiply in the broad valleys of the interior, to hold back the British colonies and cramp their growth by confinement within narrow limits. Already an ominous flow of British traders, against whom our forts have little control, moves westward from the mountains, even to beyond the Mississippi River. They are alienating the natives to our cause, and close on their heels are coming land speculators with an eye to future English settlement. Peace returned in 1748 with the signing of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Britain returned the fortress of Louisbourg to France over the objections of colonial officials. For all involved in the struggle for territory, English, French, Iroquois, and other Amerindian tribal nations, control of the settlement of Albany, far up the Hudson River from New York, was a strategic necessity. The Dutch had arrived first to settle in the Albany area in the early 1600s. Their holdings were given over to the English in 1664 with the surrender of Fort Amsterdam on Manhattan Island, yet their influence as landowners remained significant. English troops moved north to take over the Dutch fort and the rest of the colony. The main Dutch settlement, Beverwyck, was renamed Albany. The Dutch briefly regained control in 1673, but finally ceded all claims to the colony under the terms of peace reached the following year. To secure the region, a new fort was constructed on high ground above the settlement. Over the next 4 decades, the population of Britain's northern colonies continued to increase, forcing the frontier line west from Albany, north toward Lake Champlain, and to the western slopes of the Appalachian Mountains. An extraordinary asset possessed by the British and the colonials in this region was the presence of one man, William Johnson. William Johnson had come to the Mohawk Valley in 1739 from his home in Ireland to manage land granted to his uncle, a British naval officer. He established himself as a trader with the local people, dealing with everyone, including the members of the Mohawk tribe, in a manner they were unaccustomed to, that is, honestly, fairly, and generously. As historian Alan Eckert explains in his book Wilderness Empire, the Indians could scarcely believe what happened when William Johnson dealt with them. As was usual in trading deals, liquor flowed in abundance, but it was there that the common custom ended. It was normal after drinking to excess for the braves to fall into drunken stupor and then awaken to find their pelts mostly gone as payment for the rum that had been drunk, and not enough skins left with which to buy clothes and blankets and ammunition for them and their families in the months ahead. Not so when William Johnson dealt with them. This is what astounded them. When they came groggily erect the next morning, they found that the rum they had drunk was not charged against them, that their pelt bundles were intact, and that an excellent deal awaited them in the trade. In 1742, William Johnson was adopted into the Mohawk tribe and given the name Waragiayege, the man who undertakes great things. From this time on, the English had a white man on the frontier with considerable strong influence over the allegiance of the tribes of the Iroquois Confederation. War between France and Britain ended in 1748. Now a new problem arose on the frontier. More and more settlers were encroaching on territory the Iroquois still considered as their own. Tionaga, at an Iroquois Grand Council meeting at Onondaga, summarized their dilemma. There is now a peace between English and French, and since white men are always more concerned with money than with glory, there will soon come men swarming like the white man's honeybees to take up land and live where their soldiers now tremble to stay. The next years were filled with tension throughout the territory. All the while, William Johnson's business ventures and investments in land made him a wealthy man. In June of 1749, Galissonier was recalled to France by Louis XV to be replaced by the Marquis de la Jonquière, a retired naval officer. In the interim, the governor dispatched a company of soldiers under Pierre-Joseph de Saint-Laurent down the St. Lawrence from Montreal, onto Lake Champlain to the Niagara River, across Lake Erie, then south on the Allegheny River to the Ohio River. Saint-Laurent's expedition reached the Seneca village of Aliquippa in August of 1749, where he warned of, quote, designs of the English against your lands, unquote. Monacadudo, a Seneca chief, responded, "You who come to us under the name of friendship, hear me. The Indians of this country, a country that no one can own any more than a man can own the air he breathes or the water he drinks, but which is there for all to use wisely and well, these Indians need trade goods. They have accepted the English goods over the French only because they are better, cheaper, and more abundant. Thus, although the small number of French in North America meant they were far less threatening to the way of life of the tribal peoples, these same Amerindians were already highly dependent on the goods coming from British traders serving as a vanguard for land speculators and settlers. Upon his return to Montreal late in November, Saint-Laurent reported to the new governor. At the end of his report, Saint-Laurent recorded what he had learned. Father Bonnecamp, who was a Jesuit and a great mathematician, reckons that we have traveled 1,200 leagues. I and my officers think we have traveled more. All I can say is that the nations of these countries are very ill-disposed towards the French and devoted entirely to the English." Saint-Laurent had reached his conclusions based on incomplete information, to be sure. What kept the English traders reasonably honest was competition among themselves and with the French. Many traders were also intensely interested in gaining ownership of the land they explored. One such frontiersman was Christopher Gist, employed by the Ohio Company to map the frontier for future settlement. Approaching the Shawnee village of Pickawillany on the west bank of the Spele Withipi, what the English called the Ohio River, Gist recorded, "This is good country, ideal for settlement. It is fine, rich, level land, well timbered, with a great number of little streams and rivulets, full of beautiful natural meadows, with wild rye, bluegrass, and clover, and abounding with turkeys, elks, deer, and most sorts of game, particularly buffaloes, 30 or 40 of which are frequently seen in one meadow." From Montreal, the new governor had been trying desperately to obtain funds to establish new forts along the shore of Lake Erie to secure the lines of communication between Montreal, Forts Niagara and Detroit, and Louisiana. Governor Jonquière was also deeply troubled by what he knew, but could not prove, was the systematic diversion of the Crown's resources by the intendant, François Bigot, and other corrupt officials. William Johnson was also extremely frustrated and fearful. At the end of 1750, he resigned as Indian agent for the colony of New York. For too many years, the legislature in Albany had ignored his advice and left him to fund his activities out of his own personal assets. Without William Johnson to speak on their behalf, the Iroquois refused to attend any Congress called by colonial officials. Despite the many risks involved, westward migration of settlers into the frontier increased with each year, pressing on the tribes, driving away game from their hunting grounds, and turning forests into cabins and meadows into fields of corn and other crops. The situation in New France improved in some respects after the death of Governor Jonquière in March of 1752. His replacement, the Marquis Duquesne, arrived at Montreal at the beginning of July. What Duquesne found in New France appalled him. He took swift action to impose discipline on the army, demoting many officers. He called up the militia and put them through a rigorous training program. Duquesne was determined to complete the string of French forts along the course of the Escalation and to garrison them with forces strong enough to hold them against any attack, simultaneously preventing English traders from penetrating further into the wilderness. In May of 1753, Mohawk runners came to the home of William Johnson, warning of a strong French force gathering at Fort Frontenac on Lake Ontario, to begin construction of the new forts as ordered by Governor Duquesne. The Mohawk chiefs made their way to Albany to alert Governor George Clinton of the threat. Tioga took the opportunity to repeat charges that Mohawk land had been stolen, and all such sales would not be honored. He declared to Clinton that from that time forward the Iroquois League would have nothing further to do with the English. Fearful the Iroquois would now align themselves with the French, the New York Assembly came to William Johnson, pleading with him to accept reappointment as the colony's Indian agent. They met his terms, and he went back to work to rebuild the alliance with the Iroquois. Another response to the French came from Virginia Governor Robert Dinwiddie. In October of 1753, Dinwiddie dispatched the young militia officer George Washington on a mission to deliver the message to French commanders that they were violating Virginia territory and must leave. Washington returned to Williamsburg in January 1754, delivering his report to Governor Dinwiddie. The governor had Washington's report reprinted. Newspapers also reprinted the report, and young George Washington was quickly becoming famous. Governor Dinwiddie then called for volunteers to journey to the forks of the Escalation to construct and garrison a fort there, cementing Virginia's claim to the region. His public notice told Virginians, "For the protection of your very homes and lives, and the lives of your loved ones, I appeal to you to enlist in our cause, which is the cause of all Englishmen in America. The French prepare to strike us soon a crushing blow, and we must be able to defend ourselves, which we cannot do without more men. As governor of the province of Virginia, I therefore make this offer. To those who will enlist, I offer by proclamation some 20,000 acres of good land in the Ohio Valley, such land to be divided among the soldiers if and when the area is secured. Enlist now to help your country and yourself." The Virginians made it to the Escalation ahead of the French and began construction of what passed for a fortification. However, in April of 1754, a large French force appeared. The Virginians surrendered without resisting and returned home, after which the French immediately started construction of a new fort they named Fort Duquesne. With this small but important victory, French influence grew over most of the tribes from the Great Lakes region well into the valley of the Escalation. As 1754 reached its midpoint, the Lords of Trade and Plantations issued a directive from London to do whatever was necessary to secure an alliance with the Iroquois League. A Congress was organized in Albany, where Benjamin Franklin attempted, unsuccessfully, to make the case for a strong defensive union of the 13 colonies. In April of 1755, King George ordered Major General Edward Braddock and 1,000 troops to North America. The French countered with a force of 6,000 under the command of Baron Ludwig Dieskau. A new governor was also chosen for New France, the Marquis de Vaudreuil, a Canadian and former governor of Louisiana. William Johnson's role also changed. By order of the king, he was appointed supervisor of Indian affairs within all the northern colonies. From the newly constructed Fort Cumberland in Maryland, General Braddock assembled his army of 2,200 men for a march against the French at Fort Duquesne. The army finally got underway in June. Another army under the command of William Shirley gathered at Albany to move north to Fort Oswego at the southeastern edge of Lake Ontario, where he pushed the completion of several ships, then under construction, and otherwise strengthened the fort's defenses. On the 9th of July, as Braddock's army came within a short distance of Fort Duquesne, the French, supported by over 600 Hurons, Ottawas, and Shawnees, attacked in the dense woods where Braddock's force could neither maneuver as their training dictated or find cover. Braddock's army was routed, the general mortally wounded. Braddock's war plans had fallen into French hands and were delivered to the French governor and to Baron Dieskau in Montreal. Knowing that Fort Oswego was now reinforced, they decided to move south against Albany, its defense resting with William Johnson. With Albany taken, Fort Oswego could be cut off from supplies and eventually fall. Baron Dieskau felt extremely confident. Johnson is a fur trader, not an officer. His officers are country squires. His soldiers are farmers and nothings. We will wipe him away without our breath becoming heavy, and we will not offer quarter. While William Johnson waited for his own army to assemble, he put his colonial troops through intensive training in wilderness warfare under the direction of their Mohawk allies. Johnson's force finally moved north late in August, reached Lake St. Sacrament, which he renamed Lake George, and there waited for supplies. At the same time, Baron Dieskau was leading a force of 3,500 men down Lake Champlain from Fort St. Frederick at Crown Point. On the 8th of September, an advanced force of Caughnawaga warriors fighting with the French were intercepted by Mohawks under Tionaga. Fighting broke out. Tionaga was wounded and later killed in the battle. Johnson sent reinforcements forward while the advanced troops executed an orderly retreat. Dieskau now ordered his troops forward to attack Johnson's entire force. The French advance was quickly halted with heavy losses in the face of artillery and heavy rifle fire. The Baron was wounded twice and captured. The Mohawks wanted to torture him, as they asserted was their right, but Johnson protected him. The defeated French withdrew and the survivors retreated north. A large French force that included a growing number of Chippewas, Ottawas, and Hurons gathered at Fort Frontenac, preparing to defend against an expected British invasion. William Shirley, in command of the British colonials at Fort Oswego, was seriously short of supplies, and many of his men were ill, some with smallpox. He had no choice by the end of October but to withdraw to Albany, leaving 700 men to garrison Fort Oswego. As winter arrived, William Johnson assigned Robert Rogers to lead his Rangers on scouting expeditions north to Crown Point and Ticonderoga. He reported the news that the French were constructing a strong fortress at Ticonderoga. The fort was constructed where Lake St. Sacrament, Lake George, joins Lake Champlain by the La Chute River. Its garrison was charged with preventing the advance of British troops to Canada by way of Lake Champlain. The French began construction of Fort Carillon at Ticonderoga in October of 1755. Because of the corruption-plagued supply system, the fort remained incomplete into early 1757. As a buffer between the French at Fort Carillon and the English at Albany, William Johnson ordered the construction of a new fort at the southern tip of Lake George, which he named Fort William Henry. After the news of the defeat of the French force under Baron Dieskau reached the Minister of War, a new commander was selected to take over all military affairs in New France, the Marquis Louis Montcalm. Upon his arrival in New France, Montcalm immediately realized the condition of the citizens was desperate and appalling. Prices for goods were extremely high, meat and other food scarce, and the housing in very poor condition. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "Everything is horribly dear in this country, and I shall find it hard to make the two ends meet with the 25,000 francs the king gives me." A new British commander also arrived in August of 1756, General John Campbell, with an appointment as governor of Virginia as well. Montcalm decided to take the offensive and marched in force against Fort Oswego on the 13th of August. Faced with the threat of heavy artillery fire, the British surrendered. As was most often the case, warriors rushed in and began killing everyone they reached. Montcalm managed eventually to stop the carnage, and Fort Oswego and two nearby fortifications were burned to the ground. Montcalm's next priority was to see to the completion of Fort Carillon before the onset of winter. General Campbell also withdrew his British troops from the region to New York, Boston, and Philadelphia to wait for spring. Campbell then revised the British strategy, deciding to take the French fortress at Louisbourg and thereby gain strategic control over the access of shipping to the St. Lawrence River. French naval forces met them while still at sea, and the British were forced to retreat back to New York. Despite all that Montcalm worked to accomplish in the field, his efforts were undermined to an extent he yet did not realize. His aide-de-camp, Louis Antoine de Bougainville, revealed his own concerns in a letter to his mother. There must be some connection between Monsieur de Vaudreuil and Monsieur Bigot, for the latter engages in peculations almost openly, yet without reproval. Monsieur Bigot claims of himself that he is the backbone of the colony and that he is establishing what he calls the Great Society, but its greatness has thus far been of benefit only to Monsieur Bigot and those who are his accomplices. Montcalm next advanced his force from Fort Carillon and took Fort William Henry. Montcalm commanded a force of over 8,000 French and Canadian troops and nearly 6,000 warriors from over 40 different tribes. Again, the warriors could not be controlled and slaughtered all of the sick and wounded British who remained behind after the surrender. They even opened the graves of the recent dead, scalped and mutilated their corpses. What they could not know was that their actions exposed them to smallpox. Far more Amerindians died over the months ahead in tribes throughout the upper Great Lakes than fell in battle. The victories achieved by Montcalm were overshadowed by the deprivation the people of New France were experiencing under Governor Vaudreuil and Intendant Bigot. First, horse meat replaced beef. then even horse meat could not be obtained. By the end of 1757, New France was on the verge of rebellion. Once again, Bougainville shared his observations with his mother. The governor of Montreal enjoys a trading post which is worth immense sums to him. This line of business, he makes quite sure, will never be known to the minister for the colonies. On the 9th, they started to issue horse meat to the troops. The women of Montreal went and threw it at Monsieur de Vaudreuil's feet. The guilt is largely with the peculators in Monsieur Bigot's great society, who have so created a monopoly that trade is dead and prices beyond what any but the extremely rich can afford to pay. Failure on virtually every front resulted in the recall of General Campbell, replaced by James Abercrombie, with orders from William Pitt to take the fortress at Louisbourg and impose a naval blockade on New France. Abercrombie first dispatched a force of 11,000 men under Sir Geoffrey Amherst and Major General James Wolfe against Louisbourg. The undermanned and poorly provisioned fortress fell to the British after 50 days of continuous bombardment. The British now controlled the supply line to all of New France except by way of the Mississippi River. What occurred during this period on the New York frontier was one of the worst self-inflicted military disasters ever experienced by the British. In July of 1758, Abercrombie brought his army of some 15,000 troops against Montcalm's much smaller force at Fort Carillon. Instead of waiting for his artillery to be brought up and the fort destroyed, Abercrombie ordered his troops to make not one, but 4 frontal attacks. 2,000 men were killed, and Abercrombie simply withdrew from the field. Late in September, a British force under Colonel John Bradstreet surprised the French garrison at Fort Frontenac as well as the French fleet anchored on Lake Ontario. A huge stockpile of provisions, ammunition, and artillery pieces were captured. The fort and ships were burned and much of the plunder distributed to the Iroquois warriors attached to Bradstreet's army. Morale among the French in New France had fallen to a low point. Hunger was widespread, worsened by the effectiveness of the British blockade of the St. Lawrence River. Commenting on the desperate situation, Montcalm's quartermaster general wrote to the Minister of War, "Rapacity, folly, intrigue, falsehood will soon ruin this colony which has cost the king so dear. We must not flatter ourselves with vain hope. Canada is lost if we do not have peace this winter. It has been saved by miracle in these past 3 years. Nothing but peace can save it now, in spite of all the efforts and the talents of Monsieur de Montcalm." In the spring of 1759, the British began preparations for the final invasion of New France. Major General Geoffrey Amherst replaced Abercrombie as commander, and a British fleet advanced up the St. Lawrence to strike at Quebec. Amherst marched against Fort Carillon, Fort St. Frederick, and then on to Montreal. Another force marched to Fort Duquesne, then north to take Fort Ontario. On the 26th of July, 1759, Fort Niagara fell to a large force commanded by Sir William Johnson. The French burned and abandoned 3 additional forts before Johnson could mount an attack. After a siege lasting nearly 3 months, Quebec was taken. During the battle, both commanders, the Marquis de Montcalm and General James Wolfe, were mortally wounded. After yet another harsh winter, the British forces made their way to Montreal, the last major French stronghold. By early September, some 17,000 British troops surrounded the city, and the French capitulated. For the thousands of Amerindians who fought against the British, and even most of the Iroquois who had remained neutral during the war, the prospects for the future were less than encouraging. They were now fully dependent on the British and English traders for all the goods they had become accustomed to, but could not produce for themselves. New and stronger forts arose throughout the frontier. Traders and settlers were not far behind. Capitulation did not bring an end to the war, only an end to the French ability to meet the British in the field. The French still retained control over their distant posts and to the fort on the Mississippi River. Denied access to firearms and ammunition by Sir Geoffrey Amherst's decree, and no longer as skilled at hunting with the bow, a growing number of Amerindians faced great hardships and even starvation. Increasingly, settlers were moving into their territory to clear the land for farming. All the tribes needed was a leader to bring them together, to take back what they rightfully knew to be theirs, and to drive the English from their land. They found such a leader in the Ottawa war chief Obondiag. And just as the frontier was about to erupt, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially ending the 7 Years' War. France ceded to Britain all claims to territory in North America east of the Mississippi River. In May, Obondiag unleashed simultaneous attacks on British posts, on supply trains, and on settlers throughout the frontier. He was fooled into believing a large French army would quickly join him to lay siege to the fort at Detroit. In the end, the overwhelming superiority in manpower and the goods required to conduct war forced Obondiag and his allies to withdraw and seek a peace agreement that left them with very little. Another severe winter and a widespread outbreak of smallpox broke the back of the Amerindian resistance. Obondiag then did his best to find new allies among the more western tribes, the Osages, Kansas, Missouris, Mandans, and Dakotas. The victorious British faced two immediate problems in the vast territory won from the French. There were more than 60,000 French-speaking people to govern. They were also seriously outnumbered by the Amerindians.